Hey everybody, it's Phil here, coming to you from Japan again, and it's a coronavirus video this time. I haven't made one in about a week because I wanted the numbers to get up and shocking, and they've not disappointed. So here in Japan, let's do a quick recap here. That around the beginning of February or so, the first case of the coronavirus was detected in Japan. Of course, we had, if you cast your mind back to the time of the Princess Cruise Line ship that was docked here, and how unusual it was, and that there was this, cluster of cases. Well, around that time, we also had some cases in the wild in Japan. And Japan's strategy at that time, this is a little bit of a recap, sorry. Japan's strategy at that time was to do what's called cluster measures, or they call here cluster measures. And that is, you find the person who's infected and you trace their movements and you kind of corral those people. And that was Japan's approach for quite some time at the beginning of this outbreak. And it did seem to work, because for quite a long time, Japan seemed to have escaped this pandemic and the overshoot and all the rest of that stuff that was happening in other countries at the time. In contrast, South Korea did it a little differently. They tested like crazy and they sprayed the streets and all the rest of it. And South Korea also had a large outbreak, though mostly tied to churches, but had a large outbreak and managed to keep it down. Now we fast forward a couple of months from that, and it's amazing to think this has been going on for that long, that into April, other countries suffered horribly. America, Italy, the UK, Spain, Germany had lots of cases, and Japan did not really. But still in Japan, they were using the cluster measures approach. And then it became apparent that that approach works great when you have a few cases. But it doesn't work great because you can't catch everybody, right? And the difference between the coronavirus and some other influenzas is that rate of spread. It seems that it's much more virulent, funnily. And so one person can infect a lot more people than the flu, a normal flu outbreak could. So when you have these, it's small holes in the plastic bag of water, you can still drain all the water out, and I think that they didn't really realize that until very recently here in Japan. So it has now been a week since the first stay-at-home request in the 7 prefectures, including Tokyo. And unfortunately, it has not gone that well. And a week ago, we had in Japan, about 4,000 cases, and now we have almost 9,000 cases. So in a week, it's doubled. And most of those cases, the doubling has happened in Tokyo. Well, it's happened pretty much everywhere, but in Tokyo now up to 2,300 cases or so. And the thing is that I think the Japanese government is being very indecisive. And I'm really wondering why that is. They have some issues. The Constitution doesn't let them force people, doesn't give them the ability, I should say, to force people to stay at home. So you have that issue. And also, I think it's partly to say, well, maybe what we were doing before didn't really work as well as we thought. And in Japan, there's a great trust of authority here, either overt or implied trust of authority. So, you trust your doctor very much. You trust the police very much. And whether that trust is founded or not, it is kind of irrelevant. There is a great deal of trust. And you expect that what they're doing is the right thing. So I think they had to come to this conclusion that what they were doing was perhaps not the right thing, or it was that what they were doing was the right thing, it just wasn't effective in catching everything. So now we've had this massive increase of cases, and okay, maybe a doubling is not a massive increase, doubling in a week, I think it is, but you know, in my prefecture here, I live up in the northeast of Japan in a prefecture called Miyagi. And in Miyagi, we went from, 13 cases to 56 cases, and now I see that it's at 65 cases, 64, excuse me, cases. So there is an incredible increase. And what's happened is that the healthcare system is completely overrun already. And last night on the news, on the Japanese news, they were talking about how doctors were short on supplies. This is the same story that we're hearing around the world, but I just want to, I don't think we're hearing so much about it in Japan. Maybe outside of Japan, you're not really hearing this. So they're kind of running out of supplies, and non-essential doctors, if there is such a thing, and hospital staff are using handmade masks made out of surgical material, and doctors are using these visors that are made out of clear files that you put the papers in. They're cutting those up and making their own face masks, and they're running out of gowns and gloves. So it's the same crisis there, and we're not seeing a slowdown. I think that's the scary part. Okay, in many places you're seeing an overrun, but you're not really seeing a slowdown. And of course I'm going to put some graphs up here, but what we're seeing is basically that the more you test, the more you find. And there's a very disturbing graph. Tokyo has been very transparent with their numbers, even though their numbers are, I think, slightly embarrassing. They're still not testing a lot of people. For instance, yesterday they tested 250 people, and they got, so on the day that, let's find a good day here. So on the 11th, which was last Saturday, they did test 503 people, but they also ended up getting 197 new cases. So the graph of the number of people they test and the number of cases they get, they match completely. So what that shows us is that the more they tested, the more they would find. And of course there would be a cap on that. So they need to have more testing. And I've been saying this since when I started making these videos several weeks ago, that there's just not enough testing going on. And it's going to come back and bite them. They did supposedly 10,000 tests yesterday, but they're a bit sneaky with those. Those 10,000 tests, not necessarily 10,000 people tested. Even on the Tokyo graph, we see that they tested, there was 354 tests yesterday, but there was actually only 250 people. So some people they are testing twice. Japan's going to get into a big crisis, and financially there's going to be a big problem here in Japan. We're seeing a lot of downturn in business. SoftBank announced a couple of days ago that they, for the last year, 2019 to 2020, they're going to lose $12 billion. SoftBank is one of the biggest tech related companies here. They run a telephone network, a mobile phone network, and a bunch of other things. Now, a lot of that money they lost because of bad choices, but they really got kicked in the sack with by coronavirus, and so they're down quite badly. So there's not money floating around to support people. They want to have more people work from home, but then they find that the system in Japan is kind of counter working at home, so they can't get enough people working at home because Japan is very heavily influenced on paper. Lots of things are done on paper. In Japan, you also still have the hanko system, and a hanko is a personal stamp. You don't sign something, you stamp something. And these stamps are used everywhere, but of course stamps are something that has to be done to a piece of paper. There is some kind of DocuSign, online technology for signing, but not a lot of companies are using that. So they're really people are having to go into the office with their paperwork and stamp, 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 maybe one day a week, if you're lucky enough to be able to work from home at all. They have a crisis with childcare. You know, they don't have places for children. If parents are still having to work, if you shut down the daycare, what are they going to do with their kids? It's a whole knock-on effect. And you're saying, oh, but Phil, you know, in America, tens of thousands of people are dying. That's true. You hear about that on the news. I'm just making these videos so that in future generations to come, not my generations, because I don't, or not my progeny, because I don't have any children, but in future times we can say, okay, you know, it didn't just happen in America. I think it's underreported in Japan. They're trying to do some other kinds of spin, like saying, you know, this is not the first wave, this is the second wave we're seeing now, but I don't actually think that's true. There we go. It's a bit frustrating here. People are still not really taking it seriously, certainly outside of the major cities, but it's a crisis. In the major cities, it's a crisis. We're seeing it obviously with a ramp up here, tripling of cases in places like this. There's some prefectures that still claim they don't have any cases, which is probably because they're not testing. It's a very strange situation, and I hope that Japan can sort it out. I also wanted to say that, you know, some people, I got some messages and comments privately and publicly about my videos are kind of Japan bashing. And I was down on Japan, and that's not true. I mean, I've lived all over the world, and Japan's my 10th country, I think, that I've lived in. And I mean, I chose to live here. I love Japan. I love living in Japan. Japan is a great place to live because the systems work, but the whole concept of Japan is the 80-20 rule, and that is their systems are strongly designed to catch 80% of situations, and be that banking or, you know, transit or whatever. But the problem is that there's no capacity for that other 20%. So their rules are quite brittle here, and I think they're being caught by brittle rules in this situation. So I hope things are getting better where you are. Unfortunately, where I am, things are getting worse. And I'm wondering if we're one of the few countries really that's this delayed in getting it. I don't know. That's something I should look up. But anyway, I hope things are getting better where you are. I know this is a tough time economically for lots of people. So we'll all come through this. You know, it's a crisis, and a crisis ends. And a small positive note that, you know, I run a business called Zonmaster. In Zonmaster, we manage Amazon sellers' accounts for Amazon sellers. And what I am seeing, despite what you're hearing, is that our orders, the orders that we're pulling down every day for our customers, really isn't changing. So people are still buying online. There is still an economy going, and we just hope that we can bounce back soon enough. I'll give you another update sooner. Bye for now.